Marcus Thompson had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 12 years, and in all that time he had never imagined that a simple mailbox would become the center of a neighborhood war. The 54-year-old retired engineer had always been a quiet resident, keeping his lawn trimmed, his house painted, and his interactions with neighbors pleasant but brief. He paid his HOA dues on time, attended the occasional community meeting, and generally followed the rules that governed their upscale subdivision. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in September, when Marcus found a bright orange violation notice tucked into his front door. The citation, signed by Patricia Brennan, the HOA enforcement officer, stated that his mailbox was non-compliant with community standards and needed immediate attention. Marcus stood in his driveway reading the notice 3 times, trying to understand what could possibly be wrong with his standard black mailbox that had stood in the same spot for over a decade. According to the violation, his mailbox post was showing signs of weather damage, and the paint was faded beyond acceptable community standards. Marcus walked to his mailbox and examined it closely. Sure, there were a few small chips in the paint where the Florida sun had done its work over the years, but the mailbox was sturdy, functional, and certainly not an eyesore. He looked around at the other mailboxes on his street and noticed that several showed similar signs of aging, yet none of them had violation notices. The citation gave him 30 days to remedy the situation or face a fine of $150. Marcus felt a knot of irritation in his stomach, but he decided to be reasonable about it. After all, the mailbox could use a fresh coat of paint, and he had some free time on his hands. The next weekend, he spent Saturday morning carefully sanding down the post and applying 2 coats of fresh black paint. The mailbox looked better than it had in years, and Marcus felt satisfied that he had resolved the issue quickly and completely. 2 weeks later, another orange notice appeared on his door. This time, Patricia Brennan had found a new problem with his mailbox. The citation claimed that the numbers on his mailbox were insufficiently visible and that the reflective tape around the post was improperly positioned. Marcus stared at the notice in disbelief. The numbers were the same brass digits that had been there for 12 years, and he had never added any reflective tape to his mailbox post. He began to suspect that Patricia was targeting him specifically, though he couldn't understand why. Marcus decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address the issue directly. The monthly gathering was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building that served as the unofficial headquarters for neighborhood governance. About 20 residents attended, most of them retirees like himself. Patricia Brennan sat at the front table with the 3-member HOA board, her tablet and camera ready for action. She was a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and an expression that seemed permanently set to disapproval. When the floor opened for resident concerns, Marcus stood and politely explained his situation. He described the initial violation, his prompt response, and the subsequent citation for issues that seemed fabricated. Several neighbors nodded sympathetically, and Marcus noticed a few exchanging knowing glances. Board President Robert Chen listened carefully and promised to look into the matter, but his response felt rehearsed and non-committal. After the meeting, an elderly woman named Dorothy Martinez approached Marcus in the parking lot. She explained that Patricia had been issuing an increasing number of violations over the past year, and many residents felt she was being overly aggressive in her enforcement. Dorothy mentioned that 3 families had already given up and moved away rather than deal with the constant harassment. She warned Marcus that Patricia seemed to have the full support of the board and that fighting back would be difficult. As Marcus drove home that night, he felt a mixture of frustration and determination. He had worked hard his entire life, served his country in the Navy, and raised 2 successful children. He wasn't about to be bullied by an overzealous HOA officer who seemed to have nothing better to do than harass law-abiding residents. He decided that if Patricia wanted a fight over his mailbox, she was going to get one, but not in the way she expected. Marcus spent the next few days researching HOA laws and regulations in Florida. As a retired engineer, he approached problems methodically, and this situation would be no different. He discovered that homeowners associations were required to follow specific procedures when issuing violations, including providing photographic evidence and allowing residents a reasonable opportunity to respond. He also learned that HOA enforcement officers could not simply make up rules on the spot. but had to reference specific clauses in the community's governing documents. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus requested a copy of the complete HOA governing documents from the management company. The thick packet arrived a week later, and he spent an entire evening reading through every page, highlighting relevant sections and taking detailed notes. What he discovered surprised him. There were indeed standards for mailboxes, but they were far more lenient than Patricia's interpretation suggested. The rules specified that mailboxes should be maintained in good repair and consistent with community aesthetics, but there were no specific requirements about paint, condition, or reflective tape placement. The third violation notice arrived just as Marcus was finishing his research. This time, Patricia claimed that his mailbox was positioned too close to the street and violated setback requirements. Marcus measured the distance from his mailbox to the curb and compared it to his neighbor's. His mailbox was positioned identically to every other mailbox on the street, all of which had been installed by the original developer 12 years earlier. It became clear that Patricia was manufacturing violations, hoping to wear him down with constant harassment and mounting fines. Marcus decided to document everything. He purchased a small digital camera and began photographing his mailbox daily, along with comparison shots of neighboring mailboxes. He created a detailed timeline of all violations, including dates, specific claims, and his responses to each citation. He also started taking pictures of Patricia during her enforcement rounds, noting that she spent an unusual amount of time examining his property while barely glancing at others on the same street. The fourth violation notice pushed Marcus over the edge. Patricia now claimed that his mailbox post was leaning at an unsafe angle and posed a potential hazard to pedestrians and vehicles. Marcus used a level to check the post and found it perfectly vertical. He took photos from multiple angles to document this and then did something that surprised even himself. He called the local news station. Channel 7's consumer advocacy reporter Jennifer Walsh had made a career out of exposing HOA abuses across the county. When Marcus explained his situation, she immediately recognized the pattern of harassment that had become increasingly common in Florida's many planned communities. Jennifer agreed to investigate the story, and within a few days, she was at Marcus's house with a camera crew, documenting the mailbox that had become the center of an escalating conflict. The news story aired on a Thursday evening during the local news segment called Taking Action for You. Jennifer Walsh presented Marcus's case fairly but firmly, showing the timeline of violations and the photographic evidence that contradicted Patricia's claims. The story included interviews with other Willowbrook residents who described similar experiences with overzealous enforcement. Dorothy Martinez appeared on camera, explaining how the constant violations had created a climate of fear in the neighborhood. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus received dozens of phone calls and emails from viewers who had experienced similar HOA harassment. Several were residents of Willowbrook Estates who had been afraid to speak up before seeing the news story. More importantly, the state attorney general's office contacted Marcus to ask for documentation of his case as part of a broader investigation into HOA abuse across Florida. Patricia Brennan and the HOA board were clearly rattled by the negative publicity. Board President Robert Chen called Marcus the day after the story aired, offering to work together to resolve any misunderstandings about the mailbox violations. His tone was conciliatory, almost apologetic, but Marcus could hear the underlying anger. Chen suggested that perhaps they had been overly zealous in their enforcement and offered to waive all fines if Marcus would agree to stop talking to the media. Marcus politely declined the offer. He had learned too much about Patricia's pattern of harassment to simply walk away now. Other residents were counting on him to stand firm, and he wasn't about to abandon them for the sake of his own convenience. Besides, he had developed a plan that would address the root of the problem once and for all. Patricia wanted to play games with his mailbox, but Marcus was about to change the rules of the game entirely. Marcus's phone had been ringing constantly since the news story aired. Among the calls was one that particularly caught his attention. David Kumar, a civil rights attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, had seen the segment and wanted to help. David explained that Marcus's case was part of a larger pattern of HOA abuse that was becoming epidemic across Florida. and he offered to represent Marcus pro bono as part of a class action lawsuit he was building against abusive enforcement practices. During their first meeting, David revealed something that shocked Marcus. Patricia Brennan was not just overzealous. She was operating outside the bounds of her authority in ways that could expose the HOA to significant legal liability. David had obtained records showing that Patricia had been issuing violations at 10 times the rate of the previous enforcement officer, and her citations had a pattern of targeting specific residents while ignoring identical violations in other properties. This selective enforcement was not only unfair, it was potentially illegal. Meanwhile, the 5th violation notice arrived, and this one was so ridiculous that Marcus actually laughed when he read it. Patricia now claimed that his mailbox created a visual obstruction that could impede traffic safety. The mailbox sat in exactly the same position as every other mailbox on the street, installed according to Postal Service requirements and county regulations. Marcus realized that Patricia was becoming desperate, issuing increasingly absurd violations because the media attention had made her previous tactics impossible to sustain. David Kumar advised Marcus to respond to this latest violation in writing, creating a formal record of the HOA's unreasonable enforcement. Marcus crafted a detailed response that included photographs, measurements, Postal Service regulations, and references to identical mailboxes throughout the neighborhood that had never been cited. He hand-delivered the response to the HOA office and requested a formal hearing before the board to dispute all violations. The hearing was scheduled for the following month's board meeting, but Marcus didn't wait idly for that date to arrive. He had been developing a plan that would demonstrate just how arbitrary and unfair the HOA's enforcement had become. As a retired engineer, Marcus understood systems and their weaknesses. If Patricia wanted to play games with violations, he would show her what real compliance looked like. Marcus began by studying every single rule in the HOA's governing documents, not just the mailbox regulations, but every requirement for property maintenance, landscaping, architectural modifications, and community behavior.
He discovered that the documents were filled with vague, contradictory, and outdated requirements that would be impossible for any reasonable person to follow completely.
More importantly, he realized that Patricia and the board members themselves were violating dozens of these rules. Armed with his research, Marcus began his own enforcement campaign. He started by photographing Board President Robert Chen's property, documenting several clear violations including unpermitted landscaping modifications, a fence that exceeded height restrictions, and exterior lighting that violated the community's dark sky policy. He then systematically photographed Patricia Brennan's own property and found even more violations, including unauthorized decorative elements, improper trash can placement, and landscaping that blocked required sightlines. Marcus didn't stop there. He researched the public records and discovered that Patricia's enforcement position was supposed to be part-time, but she was claiming full-time hours and had received 2 raises in the past year, despite resident complaints about her performance. He also found that she had no formal training in HOA management or property assessment, despite making technical judgments about structural safety and compliance issues. The most damaging discovery came when Marcus learned that Patricia had been using her position to benefit her own business interests. She had been recommending specific contractors to residents who received violations, and these contractors were paying her referral fees for the business. This created a clear conflict of interest and explained why violation notices had increased so dramatically since her employment. Marcus compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report that he planned to present at the board hearing, but he also decided to take a more direct approach to the mailbox situation. If Patricia wanted to claim that standard mailbox installations were somehow problematic, Marcus would show her what a truly compliant mailbox looked like. He contacted the Postal Service and County Planning Department to obtain exact specifications for mailbox placement, materials, and design. Then Marcus did something that no one expected. He hired a surveyor to map his property lines and locate the precise optimal position for his mailbox, according to every possible regulation. He researched historical weather data to select paint that would last longer in Florida's climate. He even consulted with a traffic safety engineer to ensure that his mailbox placement would have no possible impact on vehicular or pedestrian safety. The result was a mailbox installation that exceeded every conceivable standard. documented with professional reports and certifications that would make any future violations legally indefensible. But Marcus's real stroke of genius was what he did next. He invited Channel 7's Jennifer Walsh to return and document the installation of what he called the most compliant mailbox in Florida. The installation of Marcus's new mailbox became a neighborhood event. Word had spread throughout Willowbrook Estates about his battle with Patricia Brennan, and curious residents gathered to watch as professional contractors installed what Marcus had dubbed the world's most compliant mailbox. The Channel 7 news crew captured every detail as surveyors marked the exact position, engineers certified the installation, and specialists applied military-grade paint designed to withstand decades of Florida weather. Marcus had spared no expense in creating a mailbox that would be impossible to cite for any violation. The post was made from reinforced steel, positioned to the millimeter according to Postal Service specifications. The mailbox itself was a premium model with reflective numbers that exceeded visibility requirements. Even the decorative elements were carefully chosen to comply with every possible interpretation of community standards. The entire installation was documented with professional photographs and certified by multiple agencies. Jennifer Walsh's follow-up news story aired the next week, showing the dramatic contrast between Marcus's original simple mailbox and the elaborate installation that Patricia's harassment had forced him to create. The story highlighted the absurdity of the situation while making a serious point about HOA overreach. Viewers were amazed to learn that Marcus had spent over $3,000 creating a mailbox installation that was identical in function to his original one, simply to protect himself from continued harassment. The public response was even stronger than before. The State Attorney General's office announced that they were expanding their investigation into HOA abuse, using Marcus's case as a primary example of enforcement gone wrong. Local newspapers picked up the story, and social media exploded with comments from residents across the county who shared similar experiences with overzealous HOA enforcement. But Patricia Brennan wasn't finished. Despite the media attention and obvious public support for Marcus, she issued a sixth violation notice just 2 weeks after his new mailbox installation. This time she claimed that the mailbox was excessively elaborate and violated community standards for uniformity and simplicity. The violation was so obviously retaliatory that even some board members privately expressed concern about Patricia's judgment. This final violation was the last straw for many Willowbrook residents. Dorothy Martinez organized a petition demanding Patricia's removal, and within days she had collected signatures from over 60% of the homeowners in the community. The petition detailed Patricia's pattern of harassment, her conflicts of interest, and the damage she was causing to neighborhood unity and property values. Marcus's formal hearing before the HOA board was scheduled for the third Thursday of the month, and the community clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Residents who had never attended a board meeting before showed up to support Marcus and expressed their frustration with Patricia's enforcement tactics. Local media representatives filled the back of the room, and David Kumar sat beside Marcus with boxes of documentation ready to present. Board President Robert Chen tried to maintain order, but the tension in the room was palpable. When Marcus's case was called, David Kumar rose to address the board with a presentation that systematically demolished every violation Patricia had issued. He showed photographs proving that Marcus's original mailbox was identical to dozens of others in the community that had never been cited. He presented expert testimony contradicting Patricia's technical claims about safety and positioning. The most damaging evidence came when David revealed Patricia's financial conflicts of interest and her pattern of selective enforcement. He showed that she had issued violations to residents who complained about her performance, while ignoring identical problems on properties owned by her supporters. The evidence of corruption was so clear that even Patricia's allies on the board appeared uncomfortable. When Patricia was given the opportunity to defend her violations, her responses were evasive and contradictory. She claimed that Marcus's mailbox had always been problematic, but couldn't explain why she had waited 12 years to notice these supposed issues. She insisted that her enforcement was fair and consistent, but couldn't address the photographic evidence showing identical conditions that she had ignored on other properties. The most dramatic moment came when Marcus himself addressed the board. Instead of expressing anger or demanding apologies, He calmly presented his research into the HOA's governing documents and Patricia's violations of proper procedure. He explained how her harassment had not only affected him personally, but had created a climate of fear throughout the community that was damaging property values and neighborhood relationships. Marcus then made an unexpected proposal. Instead of simply demanding that his violations be dismissed, he suggested that the board implement a complete overhaul of their enforcement procedures to prevent future abuse. He proposed that all violations include photographic evidence, that residents be given adequate time to respond, and that enforcement be consistent across all properties. He also suggested that Patricia be required to undergo professional training in HOA management and fair enforcement practices. The board retired for private deliberation, and the packed room buzzed with conversation while they waited. When Chen returned, his announcement surprised everyone. The board had voted unanimously to dismiss all violations against Marcus's mailbox and to implement new oversight procedures for future enforcement. But they stopped short of removing Patricia from her position, instead placing her on probation and requiring additional training. The board's decision to keep Patricia Brennan on probation rather than firing her outright left many residents unsatisfied, but Marcus had expected this outcome. He knew that the real change would come not from the board's action, but from the broader legal and regulatory consequences that were already in motion. David Kumar had filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office, and the county was reviewing the HOA's enforcement practices as part of a broader investigation into community association abuse. More importantly, Marcus's case had inspired other residents to stand up for themselves. Dorothy Martinez used the momentum from the board meeting to organize a homeowners' rights group that would monitor future enforcement actions and provide support for residents facing unfair violations. Within a month, the group had 30 active members and had already intervened in 3 cases where Patricia appeared to be reverting to her old tactics. The real test came 6 weeks after the board hearing when Patricia issued her first post-probation violation notice. The target was Jennifer Collins, a single mother who had recently moved to the neighborhood and didn't know about the ongoing enforcement disputes. Patricia cited Jennifer for having unauthorized decorative elements in her front yard, specifically referring to a small garden border made from decorative stones that was identical to landscaping features throughout the community. Jennifer might have simply paid the fine and removed the stones, but Dorothy Martinez contacted her immediately after learning about the violation. The homeowners' rights group sprang into action, documenting identical stone borders on more than 20 properties in the neighborhood, including one on board President Robert Chen's own property. Marcus personally photographed every similar installation and prepared a detailed response that made Patricia's selective enforcement obvious. This time, Patricia's violation was challenged immediately and publicly. Jennifer Collins, supported by the homeowners group, demanded a formal hearing and presented evidence that Patricia was once again targeting specific residents while ignoring identical conditions elsewhere. The local media, still following the ongoing story, covered this new development as evidence that the HOA's promised reforms were not working. The pressure on Patricia became unbearable when the State Attorney General's office announced that their investigation had found evidence of systematic abuse in multiple HOAs across the county, with Willowbrook Estates serving as a primary case study. The announcement included specific mention of enforcement officers who had exceeded their authority and created hostile environments for residents. Faced with potential legal liability and continued negative publicity, the HOA board finally took decisive action. Patricia Brennan was terminated from her position, and the board announced that they would be hiring a professional management company to handle future enforcement activities. The new company would be required to follow strict guidelines for documentation, consistency, and resident communication. Marcus felt vindicated, but he wasn't finished. The victory against Patricia was just the beginning of a larger effort to reform HOA practices throughout the region. David Kumar had been contacted by dozens of residents from other communities who were facing similar harassment, and he was building a broader legal challenge to abusive enforcement practices. Marcus agreed to serve as a plaintiff in the expanded lawsuit, which sought to establish legal precedents that would protect homeowners from arbitrary enforcement and require HOAs to follow fair procedures when issuing violations. The case attracted attention from civil rights organizations and state legislators who were considering new laws to regulate community association powers. The mailbox that had started the entire conflict remained in place, still the most thoroughly compliant installation in the neighborhood. Marcus had initially planned to replace it with a simpler version once the dispute was resolved, but he decided to keep it as a reminder of what residents could accomplish when they refused to be intimidated by bullying tactics. The true measure of Marcus's success became apparent in the months following Patricia's departure. Violation notices in Willowbrook Estates dropped by more than 80%, and resident satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvement in neighborhood morale. Property values, which had begun to decline during the height of the enforcement controversy, stabilized and began to recover. Marcus received letters and emails from residents throughout the county, thanking him for his persistence and courage. Many described how his example had inspired them to challenge unfair treatment in their own communities. A few mentioned that they had been considering moving away from Florida entirely because of HOA harassment, but had decided to stay and fight after seeing what one determined resident could accomplish. The ripple effects extended beyond individual communities. Marcus's case was cited in state legislative hearings on HOA reform, and several of the new laws that were subsequently passed included provisions directly inspired by his experience. The requirement for photographic evidence in violation notices, time limits on enforcement actions, and penalties for selective enforcement all traced back to the lessons learned from the mailbox dispute in Willowbrook Estates. 2 years after the mailbox controversy began, Marcus Thompson found himself in an unexpected position. The retired engineer who had simply wanted to live quietly in his suburban home had become a recognized advocate for homeowners' rights across Florida. He received regular invitations to speak at community meetings, consult on HOA disputes, and provide testimony for legislative hearings on association reform. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had been remarkable. Under the new professional management company, enforcement activities were conducted fairly and consistently. Residents no longer feared arbitrary violations or selective targeting. The neighborhood had returned to being the peaceful community that Marcus had originally chosen for his retirement, but with an added sense of empowerment among the homeowners. Dorothy Martinez had become the unofficial president of the Homeowners' Rights Group, which had evolved into a formal organization providing support and resources for residents facing HOA disputes throughout the county. The group maintained a database of violation patterns, offered legal referrals, and provided training on homeowners' rights and responsibilities. Their success had inspired similar organizations in other parts of the state. Jennifer Collins, the single mother whose stone border violation had been Patricia's downfall, had become one of Marcus's closest allies in the ongoing reform effort. She had discovered a talent for legal research and was now working part-time for David Kumar's law firm, helping other residents prepare cases against abusive HOAs. Her personal experience with harassment had given her unique insight into the emotional toll that enforcement abuse could take on families. The broader legal case that Marcus had joined as a plaintiff was moving through the courts, with early victories establishing important precedents for HOA accountability. Several communities had already settled rather than face trial, agreeing to implement fair enforcement procedures and compensate residents who had been unfairly targeted. The success of these cases was encouraging other homeowners to challenge abusive practices in their own neighborhoods. Marcus's original mailbox, the elaborate installation that had cost $3,000 to create, had become something of a local landmark. Visitors to the neighborhood often stopped to photograph it, and it had been featured in several magazine articles about HOA disputes. Marcus had grown fond of what he called his monument to bureaucratic absurdity, and he maintained it meticulously as a reminder of how far they had all come. The personal cost of the battle had been significant. Marcus had spent months of his retirement dealing with legal proceedings, media interviews, and community organizing instead of enjoying the leisure time he had earned. But he felt no regret about the choice to fight back. The letters he received from other homeowners, the improvements in his own neighborhood, and the broader legal changes that had resulted from his case made every hour of effort worthwhile. Patricia Brennan had quietly left the area shortly after her termination, and Marcus had heard through neighborhood gossip that she was working for a property management company in another state. He bore her no personal animosity, understanding that she had been a symptom of a larger problem with unchecked authority in community associations. The real victory was not her departure, but the systemic changes that would prevent future abuse. The state legislation that had been inspired by Marcus's case was now being considered as a model for other states dealing with similar HOA problems. The Florida Fair Enforcement Act included requirements for photographic documentation, appeal procedures, and penalties for selective enforcement that advocates hoped would be adopted nationwide. Marcus had been invited to testify before legislative committees in 3 other states considering similar reforms. As Marcus stood in his driveway one evening, looking at the mailbox that had started everything, he reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. He had learned that standing up to bullying required more than just personal courage. It demanded patience, research, strategic thinking, and the willingness to accept help from others who shared the same values. The neighborhood around him was peaceful in the fading light, with children playing in yards and neighbors chatting over fences. It looked much the same as it had 3 years earlier. But Marcus knew that everything had changed. The residents were no longer afraid of arbitrary enforcement or capricious rule interpretations. They had learned that they had power when they stood together, and that even the most entrenched bureaucratic abuse could be challenged successfully. Marcus's phone rang as he stood there, and he recognized the number of another homeowner from across the county who was facing HOA harassment. He answered with a smile, ready once again to share what he had learned about fighting back against those who abuse their authority. The battle that had begun with a simple mailbox violation had grown into something much larger, a movement that was changing how community associations operated throughout the state. And it all started with one retired engineer who refused to be intimidated by bureaucratic bullying and decided to hit back in a way that nobody expected.